My name is Suchi Talati. I'm the founder and executive director of the Alliance for Just Deliberation on Solar Geoengineering, or DSG for short. I've worked my entire career in climate change and climate policy, and I'm incredibly grateful to have the opportunity to work on SRM governance and to engage with you all. So to give a little bit of information about DSG, DSG is an organization focused on the governance and justice dimensions of solar geoengineering and thinking really critically about how to empower climate-vulnerable communities in decision-making. So solar geoengineering, just to give a little level set, is an emerging set of approaches that's becoming increasingly part of the climate response discussion. It's a relatively simple technology that is immensely complex when it comes to how it could be used, the potential impacts, and the power dynamics at play. There's been a lot of growing momentum around this space and a rush of new attention over the last year. But many climate and civil society organizations, especially in the United States and around the world, haven't had an opportunity to engage. And that's what this space is really about. We want this conversation to be a starting point for thinking about how civil society has begun to approach something that's complicated, moving quickly, and deeply political. As climate impacts grow and mitigation efforts are growingly insufficient, more and more sectors are turning their attention to SRM. That includes governments, funders, research institutions, and the private sector. And if civil society and climate groups aren't at the table, others will define the conversation. I want to be really clear here, though. SRM is not a solution to the climate crisis. It is an approach that may be able to limit some harm and suffering, but it could also exacerbate harm and injustice. We have a responsibility to democratize knowledge and build a more diverse field that has the power to represent themselves in this space. This is even more important as these discussions are gaining this growing momentum. The justice context is especially important. Communities and countries most vulnerable to climate change have the most at stake in SRM conversations, yet they've been largely left out. The global north should not be able to make assumptions about what these diverse perspectives look like. While there's growing awareness that these perspectives are needed, real inclusion is still rare. Policymakers and civil society organizations in climate-vulnerable countries need resources and space to engage meaningfully in these discussions. Without that, we risk repeating the same patterns of exclusion and injustice that have shaped climate policy for decades. That's why DSG's work is grounded in procedural justice. We believe that those most affected by SRM need to be at the center of shaping how it's talked about, how it's researched, and how it's governed. Inclusion isn't something that we add at the end of a process or just talk about. It has to be part of the process from the very beginning. And so this convening is one way to do that, especially in the United States. And to be clear, this event is not a debate about whether or not SRM should be deployed. This is about understanding where the research stands today, what people are talking about, how different organizations are engaging, and what's at stake if we don't engage. I'll get into a few more specifics about DSG's work during the second panel, but I wanted to say three things up front. So first, decisions about solar geoengineering are already being made, whether around lobbying, research, or policy, often quietly or without public input. This is one way we push back on that. It's a space for openness, reflection, and relationship building. Second, how we show it matters. And because we want to widen the circle of people who get to have a say in these conversations, we're going to ask that all please listen with curiosity and leave space for others. Third, this room brings a wide range of lived experience and strategy, and that's our advantage. Let's use it to surface what's helpful, name what's harmful, and chart what engagement could make sense. I'm going to stop there with some opening remarks and just move to give a very, very quick brief 101 on SRM, just to make sure we're level setting with some good information. So SRM refers to large-scale intentional approaches that increase the amount of sunlight reflected back into space. We have natural analogs like volcanic eruptions that illustrate potential effectiveness at temperature reduction. However, there's still uncertainty about other types of physical and social impacts, including things like biodiversity, public health, or food security. There could be benefits and harms that look different in different places. The most researched approaches are called stratospheric aerosol injection, or SAI, and marine cloud brightening, or MCB. SAI is an approach where a relatively small amount of reflective aerosols would be released into the stratosphere to reflect sunlight. MCB would involve spraying aerosolized sea salt into low-lying marine clouds to increase their brightness and ability to reflect sunlight. The potential scales, costs, and impacts will look very different across these two approaches, and you can find immense numbers of reports and papers that can talk a lot more deeply about these two things. All of this information means that this is an extremely complex space that requires a deep thought on how to build equitable governance systems that can manage both research and potential considerations about use. So let me spend one final minute to talk about what we mean by governance. Broadly, governance is any process that affects or involves decision-making at all different scales with both state and non-state actors. This means processes around both research and potential deployment, which require very different processes and ask very different questions. The needs of these two processes differ deeply right now, and we need to be very careful not to conflate them. Governance also engages all types of institutions and people, from researchers to civil society organizations to funders and governments. Oftentimes, governance is only thought of as restrictive measures to inhibit actions or exert control. But governance can also be enabling, which for research means processes or actions that can make it more feasible or lead to better versions of it.
Thanks for everyone for coming. I'm Mike Tidwell. I'm Executive Director and founder of the Chesapeake Climate Action Network. CCAN and DSG are your hosts for this event. Most of us have been at Climate Week all this week. We've been inside, we've been indoors, we've been in conference rooms. And as Suchi said, we want an open discussion. So what better place to have an open discussion than on a rooftop? I know some people, I see some luggage here. We want to send people who are headed home off with a nice drink and a nice location where we can be ourselves and have a robust conversation. So again, welcome. For the last 23 years, I have been nothing but a full-time climate activist. I have been arrested a dozen times in peaceful civil disobedience, protesting Keystone XL pipeline, trying to stop coal plants, and advocating for clean energy solutions to global warming in my region of Maryland, Virginia, D.C., and also on Capitol Hill. And 20 years ago, when I got into this work, the idea was we were going to switch to carbon-free energy fast enough to avoid the worst impacts of global warming, right? We always tack that phrase on to mitigate the most extreme impacts of extreme weather, et cetera. And here we are in 2025, and sadly, we are not avoiding the worst impacts of global warming. I just wrote this book called The Lost Trees of Willow Avenue that is about the extreme impacts of climate change on my one street in the Washington, D.C. area, from flooding to Lyme disease to disappearing trees. Basically you could throw a dart at a spinning globe on this spinning globe, and wherever that dart lands, whether it's downtown Tokyo or the highlands of Ethiopia or the 7100 block of Willow Avenue where I live, you could write a whole book about the changes that we're seeing, all of them negative, wherever we live. So my organization has been fighting like crazy to prevent those impacts, and we've succeeded. A lot of people in this room have fought a long time for wind and solar and batteries, and the good news is that revolution is well underway. Despite what Donald Trump thinks he can accomplish, every day around the world, human beings deploy a gigawatt of solar power. That's the equivalent of a large nuclear power plant of solar power every day. Half of all cars sold in the largest automobile market in the world, which is China, will be electric cars this year. Australia will be nearly 100% carbon-free electricity by 2030, and a country known for coal. So that is happening. The problem is the great Bill McKibben says, winning slowly is the same as losing. We just haven't gotten there fast enough. So what are our options? Our options are we could try to adapt to a 2.5C world. I don't think any of us think that's realistic. There are a lot of people, especially in less developed countries, who cannot adapt to that world. So adaptation, while obviously having to be part of our response to climate change, is not alone going to save us. Carbon direct capture, drawing carbon out of the atmosphere. Interesting ideas. I think it's going to be part of the mix going forward. But that technology of weatherizing rocks or building giant machines with filters and fans to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere, that technology today is where solar power was in the 1970s. It's just not ready, and we need something as soon as possible. So what are our other options? As Suchi said, there's this idea of reflecting sunlight away from the planet. My nonprofit, hard charging, left of center, get arrested, screw the polluters kind of group, we in the last year have drawn the difficult conclusion that we have to at least research this option. You know, no one can accuse us of being tech bros and techno optimists. We're not a new group. We're an established group. It took me a year and a half to get my board to have the conversation and my staff to write a statement of principles. But here we are advocating vociferously for research on this matter. But we have to have the open conversation, and we have to involve civil society. We have to hear all the voices. We have to talk about governance and technology and all these things, and we're just starting, which is why it's so great to be on this rooftop in the chaos of downtown New York to have this conversation. What we thought we would do in this first panel is talk to leaders in the American climate space who are on different points on a journey toward considering this issue of research, of possibilities, of reflecting sunlight. I have here to my immediate left Quentin Scott. He is the Federal Policy Director for the Chesapeake Climate Action Network. He comes from a long political background, working on the Hill for state legislators in his home state of Illinois and in presidential campaigns. We also, next to Quentin, we have the Reverend Lennox Yearwood, who probably needs little introduction. He's president and founder of the Hip Hop Caucus. He is a lifelong community activist and Air Force veteran. Hip Hop Caucus focuses on addressing core issues impacting underserved and vulnerable communities with programs and campaigns that support solution-driven community organizing led by today's young leaders. Next to him is Steve Smith, who is executive director of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy and is a longtime climate activist. He currently lives in Knoxville, Tennessee, and he's on the Knoxville Mayor's Climate Council and the Board of Floridians for Solar Choice. He received his doctorate in veterinary medicine from the University of Tennessee. And last but not least, we have Natasha with NRDC Vendangos. And Natasha is Associated Vice President of Innovation and Technology Policy at EDF. Before EDF, she worked at the Alliance to Save Energy and the Department of State, working on energy policy. She received a PhD in biophysics and chemistry from Berkeley. And Natasha, you were the last introduced, but I'm going to ask you the first question. EDF has pivoted to advocating for responsible research in solar reflection methods. Can you tell us in summary how your organization got there?
EDF has actually had a position on geoengineering for a long time. We've been in this conversation. Our position statement on it was put out, I think, over 10 years ago, and it still stands. And the position is really that topics that are this relevant and that are this has this many different layers of implications for us as a planet deserve study. And this, on one hand, you could view this as like a pivot, an environmentalist organization looking at topics like solar radiation modification. That's complicated. But in reality, a lot of technologies are complicated. A lot of innovation is complicated. And recently, about 2 years ago, we did a study with a consultant about the innovation process and connecting the innovation process to the concept of environmental justice. And it's very common to sort of do this sort of cartoonish distillation that you've got the science over here and you've got environmental justice topics over there, and the two are very different and the two don't meet. But in reality, if you think about science as a way of getting at our greatest opportunities for societal good, of course they're connected, of course they are there, and of course they deserve that study.
Hey, turn it off.
Quentin, I want to ask you next. So EDF has had a policy on this for a while. Your organization, Chesapeake Climate Action Network, has not. Only recently have you had a policy on this. Some people have been surprised to see a group like Chesapeake Climate Action Network come out in support of this sort of research. What kind of response have you gotten, both among other NGOs in the climate space, justice space, and among politicians, for example, on Capitol Hill?
Yeah, the politics around solar geoengineering are quite complex. When I'm engaging with my peers within the climate movement, or I'm on Capitol Hill educating staffers on this topic, the word that I actually hear most common is sci-fi. They're like, wow, this sounds like sci-fi. Or they say, wow, this sounds like that movie Snowpiercer. And so, like, the starting point for a lot of folks is to be uncomfortable. And that's understandable. Like, I think in an ideal world, none of us would be actually on this stage talking about solar geoengineering. But we are experiencing, we're living through escalating impacts of climate change. And it's forcing us to have a lot of uncomfortable conversations. And so when I'm approaching folks and having this discussion, I like to frame it around risk versus risk. We're experiencing the risk of runaway climate change, but that's versus the risk of solar geoengineering. And through research, what we're trying to understand is what are those actual risks? Now, what are those uncertainties? And trying to understand, is solar geoengineering truly possess the capacity to reduce human suffering? And that's where we're engaging our colleagues in the climate movement or on Capitol Hill. And when we make that frame, they really understand that. And so the reception has been pretty sort of like understandable. And 98% of the folks aren't like fearful of, like, we're talking about deployment. They understand the necessity for having research. And so long as we frame it around risk versus risk, people are very receptive. And I think another thing that we bring up in our conversations are our statement of principles. So CCAN established a statement of principles where the very first statement is mitigation is still our number one priority. And when we remind folks that as an organization that's been around for over 2 decades, that is still our primary focus, that makes folks feel a little bit more comfortable that we're not pivoting away from reducing our emissions. And so when we are framing the conversation around risk versus risk, and we reinforce that with our statement of principles, we get a very receptive response, and folks are willing to engage in the conversation, at least around research.
Who wrote your statement of principles?
Our statement of principles, Mike and I sat down and we drafted the initial version of it, but we actually went through a pretty lengthy process of having every member of our staff have a say. And so Mike and I set up one-on-one meetings with every member of our staff, and they gave us hour-long meetings where they were giving us feedback on what we got wrong, or things that we need to clarify, or things that we need to add. And one of the things that Mike and I didn't necessarily come with originally was we don't want to make sure that this technology isn't weaponized by the military. And so that got added to our statement of principles. So as we've added those additional principles to our draft, that really got our staff and board really comfortable with the advocacy that we're starting to engage in.
Rev Yearwood, you run one of the best known justice organizations in the United States. As far as I know, your organization has not taken a position on this issue of SRM research. What are your thoughts on this issue?
Well, first, let me say thank you, Mike, and everyone here. I want to, first and foremost, before I even get started, let me introduce someone very special who came here, Anthony Smith, who is the ambassador of Sunday, which was an amazing event this past weekend, over 500 events. Give it up for Anthony Smith. All to see the amazing Broadway star, starred as Mimi and Rent, and Hollywood actress, and all that good stuff, all those accolades. So very happy she was a part of the Sunday movement and Sunday ambassador. Also, this, for clarification, I know some of you know I wear many hats, so you know that I am here as president of Hip Hop Caucus. That's the hat I'm wearing today. My comments will reflect that, but I'm also, obviously, many of you know, I'm also the senior advisor to Mike Bloomberg. I'm not reflecting my comments on that, or I'm also an advisor to Netflix, so I'm not making comments on that as well. My comments are specifically as the president of the Hip Hop Caucus. So we haven't made clearly, as an organization as environmental justice focus, it's not that we aren't looking at the issue of solar geoengineering, and we understand it. For our community, we take things slow. Many times for EJ communities, sometimes our communities are put at risk, as we have seen from the data centers and other issues. And we feel that what does it matter if you're thrown under the bus if it's gas or EV, but you're thrown under the bus? You don't want that to happen either way. I will say, though, since I've been looking at this, one of the things, me being from Louisiana and being born right outside of what is called Cancer Alley, the 85-mile stretch of land between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, one of the things that we are looking at is that how do we transition places like Cancer Alley into Solutions Alley? And what we are now seeing here from the science of what's happening is that we need to have solutions. And so this is something here that while we haven't taken a formal position on it, we are without a doubt encouraging, and I do mean that in the strongest framework, encouraging fellow environmental justice organizations to take a very serious look at solar geoengineering as a solution that we need to have to avert the crisis. We understand that we are in a climate crisis. But the one thing that I understand as well is that while we are in a climate crisis, we are also in a crisis of imagination. And so it is critical for us to solve the crisis of imagination, to look at solar geoengineering as a real solution for what we need to have as human beings on the only planet that we know.
Thank you, Rev. Steve Smith, Executive Director of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. You're down there in the hippie United States South, making things happening. Tell us where your organization is on this issue.
I'm Stephen Smith. I'm the Executive Director of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. Our sandbox is the Southeast United States. You may have heard it's fairly conservative. Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. We have a long history of working on decarbonization, trying to reduce the environmental footprint of how people produce and consume energy. We do a lot of regulatory proceedings where we intervene with some of the largest energy companies in the world, Duke Energy, the Tennessee Valley Authority, NextEra, Southern Company. And so, we're in this moment, and I'll give credit to Mike. He kind of kicked me in the butt. He's been tracking this for a while, and Mike and I have been working together with a lot of other executive directors across the Southeast who are in the climate and energy space. And Mike's like, "Hey guys, we need to take a look at this. We need to take a look at this." And I'm like, "Yeah, okay, well, you're giving up, Mike. That's BS. We don't want to go there." And he's like, "No, you got to take a look at this." And so, he came to me, and I'm like, "Okay, we're going to take a look at it as an organization." I tell my staff, we're living in the best of times and worst of times. And you got to hold those things simultaneously. The best of times is we're seeing renewable energy being deployed at a rate that we've never seen before. Mike mentioned that earlier. Gigawatt plus a day. We're seeing countries like China all in on this right now, moving forward. We're seeing electric vehicles taking on market share in other parts of the world. We got to deal with our so-called president who's, as you heard yesterday, still struggling with the facts of the matter. But we're seeing a massive deployment of clean energy. We also have the climate crisis that is unabating, devastating. I call it climate disruption, and we've got to deal with that. So both of these things are true. I agree with the Reverend that, it's an imagination, it's a challenge of imagination. But we as an organization, as we started to look at this, you heard I'm a veterinarian. When I took my oath of veterinary medicine, is first do no harm. And I think that's got to be the fundamental principle that we use when we're looking at this, is first do no harm. We've got to basically look at what is possible without creating or making the situation worse. So my organization has been going through a very deliberate process over the last 6 months where we're bringing in information. I can tell you this, we are not at all comfortable with deployment. Not there at all. I've got rock solid, I've got 25 staff members, I've got an incredible staff, that warriors that are out there, ninjas that are out there working on this issue on a daily basis. Not at all comfortable with deployment, but we have learned a lot by engaging on this issue and understanding that we've got to understand both the positives and the negatives of what it looks like. So we're not for deployment, but if you are concerned about this issue or you're supportive of this issue, you've got to understand the science and the possibilities. And we don't have enough information to develop, I think, an informed decision yet. And because we don't have enough information to make an informed decision, we need to encourage more work. If you're for it, you're putting, it's like, this may not be the proper analogy, but this is my simple brain thinks about this. I don't want to put the world, the globe, the planet on chemotherapy and think that we're going to basically solve the problem. I'm not sure that's going to work. The more I've learned about it, the more I've become kind of skeptical about the fact that once you start down this path, you may be locking in for 100 years or plus that you're going to have to maintain it. Now, you think about the politics of what's going on over the last 100 years, I'm skeptical that we can maintain that. But we need to be honest about what that looks like. We need to talk about it. We need to put it on the table. We need to talk about it. But I also know that the fossils in the world that are motivated by financial greed are not backing off. You can see it in this administration and how the United States is doubling down as a petro state. They're going all in on this. And so if we are seeing the destruction, is this a tool that we need to have in our toolbox? Possibly. One of the things that really convinced me, and I think the DSG folks are really good about saying we got to get everybody in for the Global South across everywhere to look at this. When you're thinking about something as profound as changing the amount of, in essence, pollution. I've worked my whole life to get sulfate out of the atmosphere through diesel and through putting scrubbers on coal plants or shutting coal plants down or whatever, to actually now start injecting that doesn't compute to me, right? But the thing about it is whether you're for it or against it, you've got to understand, what if somebody started doing that? Do we know enough that we could actually detect that somebody else was doing it? So even if you're against it, we ought to understand more about how we can figure out who's doing it and possibly stopping if you don't want it. Or, the other thing is, if that is the way we've got to deal with it, let's make sure that we understand. So again, first, do no harm. We're coming to a position in our organization through our internal look, study it more, get more facts about it, and make sure that we understand what we're doing and how we're doing it. That's where we're at now.
Thank you, Steve. Natasha, next question for you. You are a scientist. How do we advance the science on this issue? And science is inherently not a moral property. It can go in multiple directions, and it takes human beings to apply morality, equity to the science. How do you do that?
This is a great question and a quite deep one. I don't want to give a glib answer to it because it really does require a thoughtful process to sort of set the rules of the road. Whenever there are topics that involve research on a topic that's controversial or that raises concerns, you want to think about research governance and what does it really mean for research to be responsible. There are a lot of principles that have been developed over the years on this. We know some of the shapes of these points. We know that transparency is important. We know access is important. We know rigorous strategies are important, and community engagement where there might be outdoor experiments is important. But a lot more work is needed on this to make sure that we have that kind of framework and detailed ideas for research governance to make sure we're moving in the right direction.
Quentin, next question for you. You are spending a lot of time on this issue. You walk the halls of Congress. You've traveled the world now, going to conferences as far away as South Africa. How do you view this issue of justice and inclusion? How do you incorporate it in your work to advocate for more research?
So this question really reminds me of something I experienced very early on when I started at CCAN. I believe this was like Earth Day 2021. A local university in DC organized panel discussions for the students, and it was a wide range of topics, and one of the topics was environmental justice within DC. And so they extended an invitation for CCAN, and I want to be clear, they weren't inviting me directly, they were inviting our organization. And so we had an internal deliberation and decided I was the best person to attend this panel and represent CCAN. I was first surprised when I showed up that I was the only person of color on this panel related to environmental justice in DC. Second, I was surprised that none of the other panelists ever talked about environmental justice. I was the only person that talked about it, to the point that I had to actually pull out my phone and reread the invitation because I thought maybe I misunderstood what the assignment was. And no, I had it correct, and the other three panelists just simply did not address it. So what I took from that experience is that, number one, if I had not shown up, environmental justice would have never been discussed. And secondly, what other viewpoints were not being included just from the four people who were there? And so I promised myself two things going forward. Number one, anytime I'm invited to participate in complex conversations around radical ideas, I need to engage to make sure that my organization and the community that I was raised in are represented in these discussions. And second, I need to bring other BIPOC voices with me into all of these discussions. And so that's what I've been doing as sort of leading our federal team at CCAN. Just this past summer, we hosted a geoengineering workshop in July with our partners at EDF and DSG. We sent out hundreds of emails. We made tons of phone calls and text messages. Some people never responded. Some people said that, it was a conflict with their schedule, but they want to participate. And so we are very committed to making sure that we're expanding this conversation. No matter what it takes, how many phone calls we need to make, we need to be making these connections. And it can be very difficult. We're also very committed to eliminating whatever barriers that exist for them to participate. Oftentimes they don't have the resources to take a flight to wherever the conference is, or they don't have the resources to stay at a hotel. And so what CCAN has offered is we will pay for you to show up to be part of these conversations, because we never want money to be the reason why not every voice is at this table. So we're very committed. I'm personally committed. Our organization is committed to making sure that we're expanding this conversation and making sure that we have justice voices all at the table to make sure that we don't repeat the mistakes in the past. And the climate movement hasn't always been perfect in its justice principles, but we want to make sure that as we're discussing this climate intervention strategy, that we build it very differently than anything we've probably ever seen before.
We're going to lay that one down. Can y'all hear me? Okay. It's going to open it up for questions. But before I do that, Rev, I was wondering, just here we are, Climate Week 2025. We heard what the president said yesterday. As Quentin said, here we are talking about something we never wanted to talk about. It makes us uncomfortable to have to talk about it professionally. We see the impacts of climate change worldwide. We see what's happened to the Inflation Reduction Act. What keeps you going, Rev Yearwood? Any words of hope before we open it up for questions?
Yeah. Well, let's first start a chant. Let them through. Let them through. Let them through. Because somebody could be hurt somewhere. It's like, there you go. There you go. They getting somewhere. They getting to. Maybe not. Maybe they're not getting anywhere. Let me say this about this issue and about Climate Week first and from what the president said. The one thing about what the president said that we must be careful of it is clear that climate has unfortunately become a cultural issue, which means that the science aspects of this will not be as important as the cultural aspects of this. It means that the minute that we say this is the greatest thing to help save our planet, depending on who says that, Lily could determine how that gets done. So we have to make sure that as we are beginning to build out a plan, if this becomes a consensus amongst to find solutions, we're going to need to find a plan to do that. And I bring that up for two aspects. One, where my Netflix hat, I have a joke that we talk about that says that any movie that doesn't discuss climate change is truly a science fiction movie. And so we have to figure out how to use culture and use culture better to tell our story, not just policy. I know that policy is critical, but we have to figure out how to get narrative into this conversation and how this can look. The second thing for me that does keep me going and gets me excited is that I actually think that we can win. So about 2 years ago, there was a vicious train derailment that happened in East Palestine, Ohio, issue that we were dealing with in regards to, I'm from Louisiana, so I want to stop petrochemicals. And so one of the things that I want to stop vinyl chloride and everything around that, because we're literally consuming a credit card size worth of plastic every single week. And then we're also literally having plastics in our brain, our placenta, and in our bodies. With that being said, this train derailment of vinyl chloride derails in the most MAGA part of America in East Palestine, Ohio. But what happened there is that the past administration would not go to that community because they felt that it wasn't, quote unquote, an EJ community. Because it's mostly white people and conservative and Republican, it didn't fit the label of black, brown, and indigenous, which is clearly EJ, but they didn't go to that community because for some reason our movement is siloed. So in this process, I actually told them, you got to go. These are Americans. These are human beings. I actually don't give a damn if it's who it is. It's people who need to be helped. I see.
Down. Separate.
1, 2, okay. So that's pretty good, strong. Okay, so I decided to go to East Palestine, Ohio. I went there with Aaron Brockovich. And I will tell you this part of the story. When I went there, as somebody who had families and friends who survived Hurricane Katrina, and I just wanted to go there because nobody should go through what my family went through. When I got to East Palestine, Ohio, two things. First of all, the president had just been there throwing hats. It literally was the place where he launched his campaign. So for the record, technically, where he launched his campaign was at an environmental justice disaster. That should scare you because he was just saying that administration only wants to care about white people. But because the movement was about science and policy, they missed the issue of connecting with people, as they will this weekend when we come to the 1-year anniversary of Hurricane Helene. And we won't even think about that again, about those who have lost Asheville, North Carolina. But I bring that up because when I went there to East Palestine, Ohio, and I saw people wearing MAGA hats and MAGA T-shirts and went there understanding the human aspect of this, I have to tell you, I was never hugged by so many white people in my life who were just looking for solidarity. So what gives me hope is that despite the lines that have been drawn, if you can get to the human side of this and the compassion side of this and the love side of this and explain that this is for future generations, what gives me hope is that possibly if we can break those barriers, then we can find solutions. But if we continue to go to our corners and talk about one another and don't realize that we're all on the same planet, there is no planet B. Until we figure that out, that either we live and survive together or unfortunately, then we all perish together. This is the moment that we are in right now.
Thank you, Rev. Okay, we'd like to open it up for questions for just a few minutes. Right there. Do you have a second working mic?
Testing. Yes, we do.
Hi, Dan Miller with the Rota Group and also with the Climate Chat YouTube channel, where we cover this subject quite a bit. I want to challenge two underlying assumptions. One is do no harm, and the other one is we have to ensure that there's real social justice in what we do, because this is not something we're doing just to do it. We're doing it to counter some other thing. And I think people generally don't appreciate what's happening with climate change, how it's accelerating, how we're going to be at 3 degrees probably around mid-century, how that is not compatible with civilization. I mean, so we're talking about the most unjust thing you could ever imagine from social and environmental justice. You can't come up with anything that will be as, and it's going to harm the people who had the least to do with it the most, and everyone too, by the way, not just them. And so we're not really trying to do no harm. We're trying to do far less harm than the alternative. Like if you had a dog that had gangrene on, you might amputate their leg, to save them, but that's harm. I don't know, but so it's a trade-off, and we're faced with trade-offs. So that's the first point. And on the social justice side, any delay in doing what we need to do to make sure that it's socially just will create far more injustice through climate change. So I just like anyone's thought on those two issues.
Steve, there.
Yeah, well, the premise of your of both my statement and your statement is that, particularly your statement though, is that we've got geoengineering figured out and so what I'm saying is that maybe, but the fact that we don't know enough yet, I am not comfortable deploying it. So therefore, it is first do no harm. What was very compelling to me is that DSG had an individual from Pakistan who spoke on video that basically talked about if you deploy this and it changes the monsoon weather patterns in South Asia, we are screwed. We're screwed worse than what we are right now. So I don't think that you can confidently say where we are yet. And my whole point was, and this is the whole point of medicine and everything else, is don't go in and try to do something that actually potentially causes more harm than the case you're in. Is climate change a challenge? Absolutely. But do we know enough yet to basically deploy this technology and understand the implications of it? Things like terminal shock, if we all of a sudden stopped it. We don't have that information yet. So first, do no harm.
I can answer the other question. Yeah, I could answer the second part. Thank you for both questions. Second part, I understand what you're saying. I totally get it. And I understand the premise. Premise is saying that, listen, why would you slow down something that actually may lessen more harm in the long term? And so I get that. What I'm talking about then will be about coalition building. And I think that there will be community. This was my get thrown under either the gas or EV bus scenario. I think that the key thing here, we've seen this already, and when we don't coalition build and do what was Quinton has been and CCAN has been doing and building coalition, is that then we'll repeat what we actually did with the Waxman-Markey process. And the Waxman-Markey process actually derailed so much that if we had built coalition before that, we would have been much farther along before Build Back Better / the IRA. So that's all I'm saying. I think that this is a matter that if you can't assume that you can't then do the agency of, I believe this is right for other communities. I mean, you're not saying that, I'm just saying, but we can't make that assumption in a way in which then we're not going to those communities and also looking for the genius from those communities as a part of the solution. One thing we've seen now, particularly in many other issues, that frontline, fence line, indigenous, black, brown, young people, queer communities have the most exciting solutions globally. And I think that in this conversation, pulling them into the conversation right now, to be not only just a part of the conversation, but to be the conversation, I think is critical.
First of all, thank you for an excellent panel. I want to touch on a few of the comments made. First and foremost, I do believe that the risk versus risk framework is a necessary dialogue. But in order to with sufficient nuance, have that conversation, there needs to be a political acknowledgement and recognition of the current climate reality. And we are not seeing that happen. And I genuinely believe it is because nobody no longer believes that we will be able to reduce emissions fast enough. Anecdotally, the Finnish climate minister this Monday spoke on that she did not believe that emissions would be reduced fast enough to shield the Finnish population from climate tipping point risk. And so the political capital required to acknowledge the problem without a viable way to win is simply too great. And so I want to ask, are we underutilizing the potential for climate interventions as a source of hope that is necessary to unlock a reality-based, nuanced discussion on our current situation?
Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. I think you bring up an interesting point there. But I think it's important that there are a lot of communities that are very uncertain about solar geoengineering, and to use that as a leading, even under the circumstances of hope, I think would not be the correct approach to have that conversation, simply because there's so much uncertainty, and there are a lot of communities that have heard hopeful messages of how any sort of future technology would be equitable and would benefit their community, and has not happened. And so there is a legitimate sort of trust deficit that we need to overcome first before we start asking communities to contemplate sort of other intervention strategies that could offer hope. And so I think it's really important that we continue to have the conversation. We continue to build the climate movement generally around, the impacts that we're experiencing. We can always point to the extreme heat. I mean, we're feeling it all now in this heat in September. And so I think it's just really important that we stay committed to having, traditional conversations about, climate impacts, pointing to those impacts. CCAN, yes, we've added solar geoengineering to our advocacy work, but it only represents about 15% of the work we do. 85% of the work we do is still talking about the necessity of mitigation. It's still celebrating solar energy. We're really focused on those kind of conversations. And as we build trust, we then can pivot towards, other hopeful solutions, and hopefully as we're engaging in those hopeful solutions or intervention strategies, it'll build sort of the public will to either make an informed no or informed yes. But I think that we have to take this as a slow process. And kind of going back to the previous question, the climate movement has really been built around this sense of urgency, and we've always put it around time. But there's also this sense of urgency around making sure that we bring as many communities along with us as possible. So I think that it's just important that we, are willing to have slow conversations and not always be, rushing to get to the next solution when there's such a trust deficit around communities.
I just love to agree with Quentin on that one, that I don't think there's a shortcut. I really don't think there's any path forward that doesn't double down on mitigation and get acknowledgement of the climate realities, completely acknowledge the challenges we're facing and the difficulty and the frustration of that. The fact that we're struggling as much as we are is, deeply concerning to anybody who lives on this planet and cares about climate change. But even in an SRM scenario, even if we come to the threshold where we decide that's the next step, where we're talking about deployment, there's no way to get there and make that work without the mitigation being at the max, without potentially CDR to make sure we're bringing emissions out of the atmosphere. So I think sometimes it can feel like, you're not saying this exactly, but sometimes in this kind of reasoning, you hear this view that, well, maybe SRM is kind of a new thing. Maybe it's a new lever that we can pull on, that we can sort of reach for, given that the other levels are hard. But in reality, it's just additional on top of the other levers, even in the case where we come to the conclusion that it's worth using.
And we're going to have to leave it there.
So I'm Michael Thompson. I'm a managing director with DSG. I want to let people give lightning intros of yourself. I'm going to do a brief setup of the panel. We're going to have a quick round of questions, and then we're going to move to a sort of town hall format. So why don't I turn first to you, Suchi, and then onwards.
I already introduced myself to you all, but just to reintroduce myself, I'm the founder and executive director of DSG, and I'm just incredibly grateful that you all took the time to come today. So I'll pass it to Ricken.
Hello. I'm Ricken Patel. I was founding CEO of Oz for 15 years, ran a global climate movement, and now a principal at Climate Hub.
Okay, so my name is Tore Laiti. I'm an Indigenous Peoples Policy Specialist from Operaatio Arctis, which is a Finnish climate strategy agency. My background is in Indigenous rights advocacy through the Sami Youth Association of Finland, and I co-chair the UN Global Indigenous Youth Caucus. And I'm here through Operaatio Arctis.
Ture, Ricken, Suchi, thank you again, and thank you all for being here. As we're saying, a very busy, hectic week. So we're going to try to do two things in this brief panel. We're going to be kind of exploring this conversation through two questions. What does it mean to consider SRM in a world where resources and resilience are so unevenly distributed? And then also how do contextual factors like age, geography, and other background characteristics influence our sense of urgency and also of caution when it comes to SRM? So I'm going to skip through the rest of my introduction because I think you get it. And I'm going to ask the following question to each of the three of you. And before we get into SRM, let's just talk climate for a minute. Can you tell us about a recent climate stressor or event or impact that you or a community you work closely with actually felt? And then how did they feel it? So why don't we start with Ture?
Right, so I'm Indigenous from the Arctic. I'm Sami Indigenous, and the kind of classic traditional livelihood that we have is reindeer herding. And as climates in the Arctic, the temperature rises in the Arctic at a significantly quicker rate than in the rest of the world, and this has a serious effect on reindeer herding. This happens throughout the year, and in the winter, traditionally, reindeer move through the tundra, and they eat lichen under a frozen layer of snow. Now, because of warmer temperatures, that snow doesn't freeze anymore at the same rates that it used to. This means that the lichen isn't protected under the ice, but rather it's wet, which means that it rots, which means that reindeer herders have to use additional money to buy lichen and bring it to the herds where they never needed to do that. This is particularly bad in southern Sápmi, but it is becoming more of an issue throughout. So this is something that is happening right now, and it's throwing the traditional subsistence lifestyles of reindeer herders into a really desperate situation.
Thank you. Ricken.
I've been thinking a lot about genocide lately. And there's one in the world that's getting a lot of attention in Gaza, whether it's ethnic cleansing or genocide. But there's another happening with a lot less attention in Sudan. And I spent a few years of my life living in Eastern West Africa, and I traveled through Darfur, it was about the size of France in 2005, during the genocide at that time. And I was just shown by the people I was with, river after river. This river flowed when I was a child. And this vast land was inhabited by nomads and by farmers. And they coexisted for centuries. The nomads would move through the territory and the farmers would stay in place. But as the rivers dried up, there was a scarcity of arable land and pasture land. And that scarcity drove conflict. And the government in Khartoum exploited it to create the genocide, basically to create an ethnic cleansing solution for the nomads to eliminate the farmers. And that is still going on in El Fasher tonight. It's a place of great horror in this world. And I believe there's a direct tie to what has happened to that land. And so for me, there's like this visceral pain of what is happening in our world as a result of the changes we're seeing and to that community in particular.
I'm Indian American, and I think there are two different communities that I want to talk about. So first, I shockingly grew up in Texas, which, if you didn't think that was the case, I'm going to take that as a compliment. It was extremely hot all the time, but I never really felt that, growing up. We had air conditioning. Most of Texas is actually massively overcooled, and people wear sweaters in July because they know it's going to be cold inside. Last year, I was in India doing work for DSG and visiting family. I was in Mumbai in February 2023, and they had their earliest ever heat wave. It was incredibly hot. When we were visiting family, they have air conditioning, but the fuel actually hadn't been delivered yet for the air conditioning to be turned on. When we were traveling to organizations and other communities to meet with, air conditioning wasn't on the table. And so when I think about these two things, it's about adaptive capacity. Adaptation might be available, things like air conditioning, things like cooling, but we might not actually have access to them in every community. And that it's a really striking way of thinking about privilege and who has access to what. And when we think about other types of disasters and other types of impacts, and so, most recently, the Texas floods were one that I thought about a lot because the adaptive capacity wasn't even there. The potential to adapt to that level of unprecedented flooding, that capacity doesn't exist right now. And so in thinking about adaptation and all of these communities, the hard limits are not ones that we're contending with, but even the soft limits are not ones that a lot of privileged communities are thinking about at all. Right.
All right, thank you. I'm going to ask a question with some overlap, and I can imagine that some of what you just said answers this, but I want to know, given the types of climate impacts you are seeing and noting that you or communities you've worked with are experiencing in real ways now, is there anything in addition to that, perspectives or circumstances that might also inform how somebody thinks about the type of climate action we want to take or the urgency they bring to that generally the policy community is not yet grappling with? I hope I made that make sense.
Gosh. I think, say it again. Yeah, sure.
Did any of them? Okay. Are there perspectives and life situations or circumstances, I'm kind of just repeating myself, but let's see if it gets through, that may not be part of the policy conversation around climate impacts yet, that may influence how someone thinks about something as drastic and as insane as geoengineering?
I can start, and then maybe has it too. So I think one thing working in kind of the climate policy world for the last few years is in thinking about some of the really big climate wins in the United States. So things like the infrastructure bill and IRA, which I'm not even going to think about what's happening to them right now. But when we were thinking about these really big climate wins, we were thinking about them in the context of mitigation. There were incredible strides made around mitigation in those two bills, and they were the biggest climate policy wins the United States has ever seen. Those two bills did not contend with impacts. They did not contend with what's coming in the near term that mitigation cannot solve. And I think that's something that's been really striking to me in thinking about why we engage with topics like geoengineering. I am not saying that SRM is the answer, and I don't think we're going to know the answer to that question for some time. But I think engaging with the conversation of intervention is acknowledging that we don't necessarily know near-term answers. And to anyone who I think pushes back on just engaging in the conversation, I think is also not contending with that very stark reality for a lot of communities.
Sure. From perspective of indigenous peoples, the thing to understand about climate and environment, when we talk about like how potential SRM deployment is going to impact people, we like to think of people as stakeholders in the issue, but indigenous peoples are not just stakeholders. Indigenous peoples are rights holders, which means that the legal landscape looks a little different there, not just in terms of deployment, but just basic research. If research has to be conducted. Thank you. If there are groups that want to conduct research on indigenous peoples' lands, then there have to be, among other things, there has to be free, prior, and informed consent from the indigenous peoples in question. This process looks different in different indigenous people's institutions. We talk about impact assessments. Impact assessments, depending on which country you are in, may or may not answer the relevant questions that an indigenous people's political organization may have. So to that end, there's the thing called the Aquacon guidelines that's specifically built to answer developmental issues on indigenous people's lands that address stuff like sustainable, not subsistence living and cultural sites. So somebody mentioned earlier that if the monsoon cycle changes somewhere in the world, then that is going to have huge effects. Well, indigenous people's livelihoods are directly tied to the earth, and that's subsistence living, not commercial, which means that even a minor change is going to potentially have catastrophic effects on a people. So a scientific group saying that, oh no, trust us, this is completely fine, that's not going to be enough for an indigenous people's political organization to say, oh yeah, totally, we have never been, told that, and something bad has then happened, right?
Yeah, I think, my first answer, I was talking about the Sudanese people in Darfur and the rivers drying up. Can you imagine what would have happened if the rivers in the United States had dried up or started to dry up 20 years ago, as they did in Darfur? The kind of emissions mitigation and everything else that would have been done in a heartbeat, and the trillions of dollars that would have been thrown at it, and the entire focus of the world that would have been pushed on it. And it is simply because the people currently dying from climate change don't happen to be in this city, that we are not moving at a greater speed and being less ideological about what we're willing to do and not do. Because damn, we would throw that stuff out if we were dying right here. That's where I feel the difference about who's being affected and how it affects policy and focus.
I've got two questions that overlap with that, and let's see. I'm gonna go back to Ture and then come back to Suji. But Ture, can you tell us what, with all this as background, what would consent look like? The way we're starting to think about this now, and you're starting to look at these conversations in the SAMI space and the way Operatio is operating. Have you all thought through the steps of what consent might look like in different scenarios? Let's please start with research.
Right. Okay. Noteworthy in this in a discussion around this topic is to point out that several indigenous peoples organizations have jointly and independently at various stages rejected SRM at the United Nations. This has a number of different roots. One is the general kind of attitude of let's not mess around with Mother Earth, right? Another is if it's being suggested as a solution to solve climate change, then it's a false solution, as many other people have spoken about here. It's not emissions reduction, right? To this, I think the quick answer is FPIC, free, prior, informed consent. What does this mean? This means that if I have something that I want to research on the lands of an indigenous peoples, I have to have free consent. That is to say, it's not either financially incentivized or under the threat of violence or eminent domain or any kind of forcing. Prior consent, that is to say, I don't show up with my gear and say, we would like to conduct a test, may we do it? That's not prior consent. And informed consent, which is where we get back to the impact assessments. In order for an indigenous peoples organization or political institution to make an informed decision, they have to have the internal capacity to make an informed decision, right? Because the power dynamics are super questionable in a situation where you have to rely on the goodwill and the word of someone else. And then finally, consent. Even after the three earlier steps, if, after weighing the pros and cons and where they might ideologically stand on a position, a given indigenous people's political institution may still say no. And, consent is important, as we like to say. So if you don't have consent, maybe don't conduct that research on those lands, yeah?
Suchi, can I turn to you? What are some thoughts you have? And if anyone thinks that she's my boss and there's a setup going on here, you're absolutely right. So enjoy the beers. How do we think about with everything that Ture just laid out? I mean, consent is going to contextually and structurally maybe look different in different circumstances, right?
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts, and I want to talk about this kind of outside of my DSG work and more in the research governance space. I've been engaged in outdoor experiment governance through ScopeX and also through now ARIA, and I think, which is a UK funding body that's funding multiple different types of projects in the climate cooling space. And in thinking about this research governance, consent comes up a lot. And I think from an indigenous perspective, there's a very clear definition. And I think outside of that, there are a lot of communities who don't know how to engage with that question, which makes it hard for them to make demands. And I think from my perspective, I think I don't actually know the answer to what consent should mean in the context of different experiments or to different communities. And when I don't know, that means I want to actually create the answer to that with the communities that are going to participate in a potential experiment to ask, what is a process that would be sufficiently good for you to be, to engage with being participatory in where this research experiment might happen. Well, that's not easy to build. I think it takes a lot of time and process and resources to be able to have co-creation conversations about what governance looks like. And I recognize that that's not easy, but I think it's also, it's necessary, right? We've seen political backlash from experiments that have not worked to engage with that question. And so if we want to see research succeed, if we want to see good research succeed that is responsible and well-governed, we have to start thinking about how to create systems that people have trust in. Do you want to...
I do want to turn to you, Rick, and I'm going to then ask a question of all three of you. In a theoretical future where there is a broadly perceived legitimate decision to do some sort of SRM deployment, if there is a situation where benefits and harms are uneven, as they often are, what protections must be in place from the start? We have a bunch of questions about who should be responsible for paying, who should judge when harm has occurred, how might answers differ between well-resourced and highly vulnerable communities. I know, Rick, that you are starting to think about this space because you're being forced to, right? And so, but from your perspective of bringing all the work you did with Avaz, how would you start to answer this question?
Yeah, it's a huge one, right? And we're just at the beginnings of trying to answer that question. And I think number one, there's the setup, right? Like we could get to a world where we all sit around and feel pure about not doing anything about these problems because it's difficult and complex, and and then these tipping points and feedback loops hit, and Saudi Arabia and Elon Musk team up to do something about it, right? And none of the values and the wisdom and the processes that we have would be included in that. And probably none of the good science that we would run to understand what looks like a bad option, we wouldn't even be equipped to call out the bad options. And so that's kind of future one. And then I think future two that we're all working towards here is let's anticipate that scenario and say, when you're sitting in the chair, all of us sitting in the chair at that moment, going, okay, what do you know? What do you know about what this will do to the monsoon, to the ozone layer? What kind of termination shock is involved? Have you eliminated any of the unknowns? Who have you got in the process that's able to legitimately make those decisions? Have you built trust over time in a certain And realistically, do you have any chance at all of constraining the major players like China and the United States that have both the power of deployment and the power of deterrence? They can deter anybody else from doing this stuff and just do it on their own if they choose to. Have you built a system that realistically can inform, and show them why it's in their interests not to do it a certain way and to do it another way? And do the lobbying and advocacy at that point? Like, that's the scenario I've got in my head of like, are we set up for success at that moment, or at least are we set up to limit the worst possible harms of that moment?
I could super quickly. So when it comes to land use of indigenous peoples, we can turn to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and it does contain provisions to, what are the obligations of the state in the event that the right to free, prior, and informed consent on stuff happening on the lands and waters of indigenous peoples does come about. And in a nutshell, it is real, equitable, fair compensation. Now, in order to identify what that looks like, you obviously have to have genuine processes together with indigenous peoples. And it should also be stated out loud that compensations of, like these provisions are in the case of failure to abide by the articles, which the number escapes me right now. Additionally, like right now, already indigenous peoples communities have to move from different islands on the coast of northwestern America because of permafrost thaw. So adequate compensation is already a thing that is being discussed. What does it look like for an indigenous people's community to move from one place to another when they have relied on the specific environment around that very specific space to move to another place? Is like are these two places comparable in terms of like subsistence, for instance?
Sure. Super quick. I think when we think about harms and the types of questions people have, I think one thing that we can think about at this point in the timeline is engaging with people to understand what questions they still have. When we've gone to different types of communities in different countries, the types of questions people ask about, the immediate question is what would SRM mean for where I live? And the truth is we don't have enough answers. And the specific types of impacts that they ask about are not ones that we're actually engaging with right now in the research community. And that's because traditionally research has been curiosity driven. Academia has often been really siloed from the people that they're trying to serve. And so bringing these communities together to start engaging with better answers to what harms could look like, I think is a first step that we can really start contending with right now. Dr.
I'm going to take Oliver Morton's lead. He's a very able moderator, and one thing he's been doing lately is just not wrapping up at all. So I'm going to skip that, and in lieu of that, I'm going to ask if any three of you want to answer one of the two following questions. What would make you want to walk out of this conversation, and what would make you lean into it further? Your option B is a bit more provocative, but even with strong climate action, some climate harms are going to worsen. So in your context that you work, what criteria make a harm acceptable as a temporary trade-off, and what kinds of harms feel beyond the pale? Anyone for either. And I'm going to make you pick one each. So why don't we start with Toure? He's got the biggest smile on his face.
Thanks. For me personally, the thing that makes me want to, walk out of these spaces is when people engage in the rhetoric of, someone is going to be left behind because of the flood, but it's not going to be me because I am going to have the biggest boat kind of approach. The seeming willingness to sacrifice others, other nations, other peoples, because of an undue assumption of safety in for instance, in SRM, which requires research, right? That would be my answer.
I'm gonna take the B one, and you're asking the hard ones now. First of all, on the harm discussion, I really appreciate the do no harm discussion that happened earlier. I thought that was really very interesting and on point. There's a culture that it prevails, unfortunately, in my sector, in the nonprofit sector, of like an ounce of harm from action outweighs an ocean of harm from inaction. And I don't know what you all learned in your college ethics class, but that was not a position. That was not a position that you could kind of credibly defend. You have to take responsibility for the consequences of action and inaction. And that's where I would, in that situation, painfully weigh both and painfully weigh the abilities of different societies to adapt to and hold that kind of harm in order to metabolize it and support the individuals involved in it. But that's the kind of framework, a harm, risk framework that we have to make these really hard decisions. I think too often we who want to change the world can default to a very convenient idea when we oppose something. The alternative is a utopian fantasy and not take responsibility for what the alternative is. And I think the stakes are too high this time, guys. We can't afford to be stupid activists. We've got to sit in the chair with the policymakers and understand the hard decisions and get behind the best option, because we're up shit creek. There is no perfect option here.
You can't clap before my answer. That's just, what am I supposed to do? No, that was a really good answer. It deserved claps. I'm going to take a bit of a cop-out. I'm going to take option A, but my answer is I actually think the thing that is actually making me want to leave the conversation is making me want to lean in more, which is seeing the space start to be much more filled by people who think about SRM in a profit or in a power motive, which scares me. I think over the last couple of years, the space has shifted really significantly in seeing different types of money and different types of interest around SRM. I come to SRM from a purely justice motivation, and I think SRM exists foundationally because of justice, because there are harms that are coming, and we need to think about potential pathways that could limit that harm. But when we think about other types of motivation, whether it's about control or whether it's about thinking about extremely strange mechanisms to make profit from the space that could end up creating more harm, it terrifies me. But I think that actually is a moral imperative for those of us who care about serving the public good and serving people to shape it. I think it's our responsibility to ensure that that doesn't happen, which is not possible unless we have more people that are part of it.
I want to thank all three of you. Really appreciate you sharing your thoughts with us. I think the four of us are gonna stay on stage, and I think be joined by others for a kind of town hall. Oh, we can take questions? We're gonna take questions. Okay.
Cheap one. Yeah.
Yeah. Does it work? Yes, it works. Thanks for the panel.
Can you tell us who you are and who you're with? Yeah.
My name is Ben, and I am.
If you want to tell us, right?
I'll say, with a disclaimer, I just started working for New York State Department of Environmental Conservation a week and a half ago, so very, very new to that, and I can't
Understood.
say that I am. My opinions are my own, is what I'll say. And so earlier you mentioned about characteristics that may not be considered in the policy decisions regarding SRM. And I think when you mentioned age, that really hit a note with me. I am a Gen Z person born after 2000. Sorry, everyone.
They're not all younger or older than you behind you, so.
And specifically with sulfur aerosol injection and the risk of termination shock with that is something that is on my list. I actually have a document of things that would make me reconsider wanting to have children. If termination shock happens. And so that's something that is not being discussed outside of limited circles in academia. the and this very human element as to what the Reverend was saying earlier. So, in the face of that risk, do you think we need, if we're going to do sulfur aerosol injection, will we need like a new kind of UN or a new kind of global governance in order to make sure that termination shock doesn't happen, or
You tacked on an enormous question to
I'm
that.
sorry,
Let's see who's game to throw out some elements we might need to consider or answer something like that, and also talk to the need for additional youth perspectives getting involved in this now.
I am with you, I think, in not being for deployment, in the sense that we just don't know enough to make any kind of decision at this point about the risk and about termination shock. But I want to share with you one of the strongest arguments I've heard for deployment, because it speaks to the termination shock issue, which is that if you were to put sulfates in the atmosphere, it would not at all be a novel thing to do. It's what we've been doing for 200 years with coal-fired plants and with shipping emissions and various other sources. So we have been doing a vast, dirty, terribly inefficient protective sun shield with SO2 for 200 years, and it has worked. It has protected the Earth, and it has cooled the Earth by IPCC estimates, 0.3 degrees. Some estimates go over 0.5 degrees.
Particularly in South Asia.
Yeah, and in South Asia. Now, activists like me and us, I think we have successfully managed to get coal being phased out. We're closing some of those plants, and we're changing the shipping emissions. And now that's tearing that protective layer away. So we are going to trigger, we're already at 1.5. Our actions as climate activists are going to trigger up to 0.5 degree rise in the Earth's temperature. Can you imagine the impact of that? Not just on risk, but actual real impact on people, on lives. So the strongest argument for deployment I've heard is like, there's no uncertainty about just trying to replace that protection, just trying to keep it there. There's no that's just one of the strongest arguments I've heard. And yes, there's a termination shock if you remove that protection, but we're about to go through that termination shock. Like we are already doing that termination shock by taking those sulfates out of the atmosphere right now. Yeah.
Just a quick response from me. I think when we're thinking about a lot of the issues that come with SRM, we're thinking about them in a vacuum. And I think it's incredibly important to remember that SRM is a potential part of a broader climate response portfolio. SRM as a temporary measure to potentially help cool the planet while we decarbonize and build up carbon removal are essential. They are completely unentangleable to me. You cannot have SRM without CDR and without massive successful mitigation. That is the only way to really think about how to prevent things like termination shocks. So once you stop SRM, we have the systems in place where we have lowered temperatures to a safe level. But I think that question is so, I think, essential to how we think about SRM in the broader climate space. It does not exist in a vacuum, and it can't.
Super quickly from me. Hi, Ben. I'm also Gen Z, so you are not alone here. I don't think we need necessarily a new United Nations. I think that big countries like the United States need to figure out how re-examine the way that they act at the UN, because the US in particular is a country that at basically any cost will not become a signatory and ratify any convention that might in some manner dictate what the United States can or cannot do around the world. And that poses massive problems for basically the rest of the planet. So people have to start playing ball is the name of the game.
Well, I hope the speech yesterday made you hopeful that we have time for one more question. I saw that this gentleman here had his hand raised first, so we'll go with you.
Thank you. I'm Herb Simmons. I'm the host of the Climate Emergency Forum, co-founder of the Healthy Planet Action Coalition, and actually we did a panel on nature-based climate interventions with Mike earlier this week, and Jody next to me. It seems to me that and really I'm asking as much, is it time for a kind of a transition in the model of the nature of not the substance of the research, but the model of how it's undertaken? Right now it's decentralized. You have ARIA, you have Silicon Valley funding something. It's sort of whoever comes up with 10 million or 2 million or whatever on this topic, on that topic. This is a public good that we need to get an answer, the whole world community, do it or not, do it under these circumstances. And I guess what I'm saying is it time to move to a mission-based research model? And of course, you have to find out the challenge is who sets the mission, whether it's down the street at the UN or the cops or whatever. So that lets us say, we're going to come up with $1 billion. We're going to say we want answers in 5 years. And then we'll have this, well, not just then, but even during, we'll have this extensive citizen participation process.
Look, I'm going to thank you. I'm going to cut you off and summarize it. Thank you. Is it time for a mission-driven approach to research?
I'm not sure. And I think what concerns me is around who would be driving that process and who would get to be part of that research community. I think we don't have sufficient local researchers in a lot of vulnerable countries prepared to be part of that. I think, one organization is the Degrees Initiative that has built an amazing community of researchers across the global South. And we still have so many more people that need to be part of the process. So when we think about mission-driven research, I think there are a lot of analogs where that has been problematic, and there's been analogs where it's been successful. But I think who drives the mission, who ultimately sets goals and why and towards what outcomes. And I think we talk about things like participation and engagement as these kinds of vague terms, but the specificity and the guidance around what that should look like and for what is incredibly complicated. And so thinking about what would go into that design is something that I think we're not yet ready to contend with, in my opinion.
So my answer to this question, I chafe a little bit against the topic that this is an SRM discussion, because what I find in engaging with this problem is that it's, for too long, the conversation has been frozen because we go very quickly to the tech, to a solution that's controversial and risky. And then it gets frozen because, people disagree for really good reasons about the tech. And what I have found much more helpful, and I've had like hundreds of conversations now with people in the climate movement and governments and leaders and stuff about this, is like back up from the tech and go to the problem. Like, are we on track to avoid catastrophic climate change? Does anybody think we're on track? Do we have a plan for that? Does anybody think we have a plan? No, I haven't seen anybody who has a different answer to those two questions. And that gives us a lot of unity to then say, okay, what's the plan? And there, I feel, yes, we need a massive surge of research. And there are folks in the mitigation camp who say, there are game changers we can employ here. Bill McKibben, the sun is coming. Like, I talked to him at length about this. He's passionate. And I feel it too. We've fought hard for this, and it's happening. The revolution is happening. And maybe it'll hit the hard-to-abate emissions too if the Chinese invest heavily in sustainable eco-fuels and stuff like that. Like, yeah, maybe we're not going to go that far through overshoot territory, but we're going to be sitting in overshoot territory for a while. That's for sure. And there are these landmines in the system. And what if we had an all of the above approach where we go hell for leather on mitigation, but have an insurance policy ready in case? And yes, then go with the research, not with a mission to deploy, but with a mission to understand the implications of deployment and to give us the best chance of making wise decisions in that moment. That's the plan that I feel really I can get behind, and that I found a lot of people say, yeah, that sounds sensible to me, and so yeah, I'm hopeful that can be the collective purpose that we try and enact here, because time is running out.
Great, thanks so much. Hi, I'm Minor Sinclair with the Center for Progressive Reform. And going back to Michael's question about what kind of may take you out, I guess I'm worried about, is a solution that takes the pressure off the oil and gas industry. We got this. We got carbon capture and sequestration. We can keep pumping and just sort of take it out as smokestacks. Isn't that I didn't hear that concern. I'm curious to hear how that fits into your thinking.
I'll take it.
Well, let me. So I have a tendency to think about it this way: we got takers, we got fakers, and we got flakers in this issue. The takers are the ones that will completely take advantage in the fossil fuel industry and basically take advantage of what's happening and use it as a reason to back off and continue to push carbon out at an extraordinary rate. And then you got the fakers who basically largely are funded by them. And I'll just go ahead and say this, I mean, I hate that Charlie Kirk was killed, murdered. I think that's devastating, but he was actually funded by the fossil fuel industry to a large degree on his positions on climate change. We need to be honest and own that and realize what it is. There are a number of these people out there that will basically take the position tribally in my region and basically embrace fossil fuel as the answer. So you've got the takers and you got the fakers. And then you got the flakers. I mean, we just saw this whole shit go down about chemtrails, all this stuff. Even the EPA director had to come out and try to push back on that because, there's all kinds of sort of QAnon conspiracy theories and everything like that. So you've got a whole range of folks out there that we've got to deal with in trying to sort of manage through this issue. And I'm not sure that they are genuinely interested in trying to find what is the best scientific solution to solving the problem. They have a whole bunch of other things going on. So it's a complicated scenario that needs to be disentangled, and it's very difficult. I think your point is well taken.
I had a really quick response. I think it's an extremely valid concern, and I think the only way to make that not the case is for more people to engage with the conversation and to make sure that doesn't happen. We have to shape governance mechanisms that prevent that outcome, and we actually have to have a lot more people demanding that we make that so.
Yes, Winton. Is anyone from CCAN, since you all are new to this space? I was dealing with more as.
Yeah, so I think the fossil fuel industry will always find some excuse to keep pushing their product. I mean, we see that around data centers. We saw that around the war in Europe between Russia and Ukraine. There's always an excuse. And so, as Suchi just said, we have to engage. We have to make sure that we are staying principled to our mission. Where mitigation is our absolute priority. And so we need to continue to, alongside this advocacy for research, we need to also be making sure that we are tying that directly to lowering our emissions. And so I see it as a reason to engage more, to make sure that they don't use this as yet the next excuse. And so, we see this as an opportunity to just continue to put pressure on decision makers to not allow them to do exactly that. And so, we're going to stay committed to that.
And I would just add from the EDF side that moral hazard is a complicated thing, and it's very easy to take any argument to the logical extreme and shoot it down. So one can say that, if you say that moral hazard means that we can't do anything else other than one very specific climate strategy, the only type of mitigation, and moral hazard arguments have been made for methane reductions, it's been made for adaptation, it's been made for CDR. There is a version of this where it just becomes a bludgeon for any other climate strategies. But there's also a very real reality, which is the blending of interests behind this can very much make for a bad outcome. So where are we in the middle of that spectrum? And the real answer is it comes down to the governance. It comes down to the rules we set for ourselves to make sure that we're not allowing that kind of co-opting of the process.
Hi, I'm Paul Gamble. My new organization is Project Breathing Room. And my question is sort of a follow-up to Herb's question about like the mission and the strategy. It seems to me that, and I don't remember whether it was Suchi or Ricken who said a scenario where it's like Saudi Arabia and Elon are teaming up. That to me seems like the actual most likely scenario from this day forward. Like business as usual ends up resulting in that. And that's the worst case scenario. None of us want that. And what we want is a much more just approach, more thoughtful consideration, better governance mechanisms, and a lot more research because we have a lot of questions that we need to answer first. And so I bring this up because one of the things that I have heard all week long at the different SRM events is a position of, I'm for research, but I'm not advocating for deployment. And I want to ask about a potential framing because I don't think that that's the reality that we live in. From a scenario planning perspective, I wonder what you think of a framing of default scenario is worst case scenario. And in fact, our job is actually to make sure that that does not happen. And we have a lot more positive effort going into preparing and mitigating some of these many and valid potential harms. What do you think of that framing in terms of how it affects the growth of this ecosystem?
I'm not quite ready to make assumptions that we're heading towards a worst case scenario because I am still an optimist. Somehow, I really have no idea how. I do think there are better versions of the world that we can still build, and I don't want to motivate people entirely out of fear. I want to motivate people about wanting to engage in a broader conversation and for them to then shape the conversation. And so I think the framing for me against kind of this kind of worst case deployment scenario is that we don't actually know if that's going to happen. We don't know if deployment is necessarily the answer, but we need people to ask the right questions. And I would much rather see us coming from a space of collaboration and optimism and hope to shape a better future. And that's kind of the place I'm coming from.
I think of this that we need to move at the speed of trust. Move at the speed of trust. And so therefore, I completely get the fact that tech bros, Kara Swisher calls them, they're basically technically broken. But I think that the reality is that we need to basically build a broad-based understanding of what we're going on and get people to collectively buy into that. And so if Elon and the Saudis get it, or, if ExxonMobil and, Occidental decide they're going to deploy it, or some company feels like they're going to make a bunch of money off of selling carbon credits by, putting balloons up in the atmosphere or whatever, that's not the speed of trust. I think what Sashi and her groups are doing, and other people, about really trying to build that broad base of understanding, that's building the speed of trust. And I think that's ultimately where we need to have as one of the top principles in whether we move forward and how we move forward on this going forward.
This is just a cap on that, but I think the idea of starting with the argument that some group has made an assessment and this new thing is inevitable is a political non-starter. It is just the quick, surefire way to ensure that we don't get to any version of kind of legitimate decision-making on this topic.
Nita Grant from Rutgers University. I have a question to the panelists as a up-and-coming scientist. What are some of the questions that remain that scientists can answer? So what are the uncertainties and that type of thing that we can answer, and how much of it is that versus just the ethical, moral, governance questions? So are there any things that scientists can still help in that debate?
I'll try taking that one. My answer is OMG. Have you noticed how many uncertainties we're talking about here and how much science is needed? If there's one thing everybody takes away from this panel, it's that there is a lot of work ahead of us if we want to lean into options to address the climate crisis. There are so many questions. What we really need is to empower more young scientists like you and ensure that there are funded mechanisms to make sure that we're supporting that research, both with the infrastructure, the full career, and the direct resources for your research to make sure that you can answer those questions in a way that really helps take us to the next level. So thank you for what you're doing, and keep at it, because we need a lot more of it. Your colleague Lily was on a panel that we hosted last night talking about specific questions about impacts of SRM research, of SRM on agriculture, on water cycle. These are just really important topics, and so much more is needed.
From an indigenous people's rights perspective, these two are nested subjects. And that's why, again, I want to highlight impact assessments, because the uncertainty on impacts from even research that haven't been satisfactorily thus far presented to indigenous political institutions like the Sami Parliament or Sami Council are chief reasons to why indigenous peoples organizations, indigenous peoples political institutions are skeptical, right? So if you want political support, you're going to have to demonstrate that it's not going to make things, at the very least, worse.
Time for one more?
Not an ask. Oh, yeah. Let's see if I do worth it.
Somebody wants to ask a question. So.
Hello, everyone. My name is Grace Adcox from Data for Progress. We are a public opinion think tank and know a lot of your work here, so really grateful to be here. A question that I have, and I want to touch on what Ture was saying earlier around free, prior, and informed consent, is we think a lot about how projects will be, or research in this case on SRM, will be received by communities that are hosts of such research. And I think that one thing that I'm really curious about is the situation in which free, prior, and informed consent is withdrawn. And really, I'm curious as to what sorts of feedback mechanisms or governance structures that you think, or even policy approaches that perhaps can redress challenges with that informed consent being withdrawn over the course of research, or even eventually, potentially, the deployment of SRM.
So indigenous peoples are not a monolith. We are talking about roughly 5,000 distinct cultures all around the world with very, very, very different systems of governance, which means that there is no uniform answer to how do you gain free, prior, informed consent, and what does it look like to maintain that consent, an open dialogue, maybe a commission. In Finland, there's this thing called the Sami Climate Council, which is an expert body comprised of both Sami scientists and traditional knowledge holders from Sami, and they are considered an expert body on all things climate in Sami. So the Sami Parliament in Finland refers to their opinion on these things. That's a key kind of stakeholding body in discussions in Finland. Maybe something like that can be, something to look as a model elsewhere. But again, this is really dependent on what the community and what the peoples and what their governance structure looks like around the world, and about the wealth of that peoples. A lot of indigenous peoples that are represented in climate politics, in any politics really, are predominantly from the global north, and especially Sami politicians, because even though Sami are indigenous and are considerably poorer than the rest of Nordic societies, that we still enjoy the passive benefits of social democracy, right? But that is not the case in the rest of the global south. So wherever the median line of income is in the global south, indigenous peoples over there are considerably below it. So even identifying the correct rights holder groups can be difficult.
Listen, thanks for coming, y'all. I think in the history of the world, this was probably the best conversation ever on this topic. I'm just going to go ahead and declare that. Thank you to Suchi and your team, and to CCAN staffers. If you work for Chesapeake Climate Action Network, raise your hand. If you work for DSG, raise your hand. Outstanding. They did a lot of work to put this together. Thanks, everyone.
Great job.
Just want to echo my thanks to Mike and the entire CCAN team. We're taking small steps and having bigger conversations, and having partners like CCAN is unbelievably invaluable. So thank you all again for coming, and I want to reiterate the open bar. Have a good evening.
Sure.